Well, good afternoon. We just finished behind us here in Franklin Circuit Court a long and I would say very successful argument. Principal Deputy Solicitor General Jack Hayburn did just an exceptional job. He was an outstanding advocate for the Commonwealth and the families that we're representing. I think the judge understood each of our arguments. He asked great questions and we're grateful for his time. This case has been dragging on for 20 years. It's involved tremendous resources by the Commonwealth, countless hours of argument, but it has failed in those decades to deliver justice for the surviving families. It's time for this case to end. Not to sweep anything under the rug, but to uphold the rule of law and to recognize that this is needless delay, to recognize it simply for what it is. If the court dismisses this case as we're seeking, it'll pave the way for around a dozen death row inmates to finally receive their sentence. And the surviving families in each case will receive the justice that they have long awaited for the loss that was brought on them. It's time for justice to come for Carew White, who killed 3 elderly Kentuckians in a small town grocery store in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. It's time for Benny Hodge, who murdered a young UK sorority student by stabbing her so hard that the blade dug into the floor underneath her body. And for Samuel Fields, who slashed a woman's throat in her own bedroom before burying the knife in her head up to its hilt. These gruesome criminals deserve the lawful sentences that they received from Kentucky juries. One of these cases is personal to those lawmen sitting on my left and my right. In 1992, Ralph Bays ambushed 2 Kentucky law enforcement officers who were serving a warrant, doing what we ask the men and women of Kentucky law enforcement to do every day, doing what the men and women of Kentucky law enforcement will be doing this evening while we're asleep home in our beds. For more than 30 years, the families of Powell County Sheriff Steve Bennett and Deputy Sheriff Arthur Briscoe have been coming to courthouses much like this, looking for justice. And time again, they've come empty. Last year, I asked Governor Beshear to fulfill his legal obligations under the Kentucky Constitution and sign a death warrant for Ralph Bays. Now I'll tell you, although Ralph Bays' name appears on the case that brought us here today, the so-called temporary injunction issued 16 years ago in this case doesn't actually apply to them, does not apply to him. Governor Beshear needs no new law, he needs no new regulation, he needs nothing passed by the General Assembly to sign the execution warrant. In fact, he can do it today, perhaps instead of a press conference, and he should. This case in particular, it's been dragging on for 20 years. Sheriff Bennett and Deputy Briscoe were killed more than 30 years ago. I was in high school when those 2 law enforcement officers were assassinated on this side of the road. So I'm standing here today as the Attorney General of this Commonwealth to tell victims and their surviving families that they are not forgotten. Justice has been tragically delayed, but we have been and will be fighting hard to ensure that that justice is not denied. That's what brought us here today. Our Commonwealth promised these families, these law enforcement officers, and their communities that we would deliver justice. We will not give up on them. Now with me here today, I'm especially honored that Powell County Sheriff Danny Rogers came up from Powell County as we were discussing a few moments ago inside. It would have been him. This is very personal to the sheriff. It would have been him slain on the side of the road doing what he does with one of his deputies every day. Joining us also today are some of the dedicated lawmen who investigated Sheriff Bennett and Deputy Briscoe's murders. Even after all these years, they continue to show up for these families and these brothers slain wearing the badge of our Commonwealth. Former Kentucky State Trooper, and I'd like for him to, he'll dodge the microphone, but I would like for him to stand up and be recognized. Former Kentucky State Trooper Larry Patterson, who secured the defendant's confession and worked for 2 years. Thank you, sir. Secured the defendant's confession and worked for 2 years with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to prepare for trial. Decades and decades ago, he awaits the outcome. Lead KSP Detective Bobby Motley, who I'm proud to say still works with the Attorney General's office. Lieutenant Motley, would you please step up and say a few words, sir?
Thank you, General. I've got a statement that I prepared that I want to read. In January 1992, troopers and detectives from the Kentucky State Police Post in Moorhead responded to a shooting involving law enforcement officers. Upon arrival, we learned that Powell County Sheriff Steve Bennett and Deputy Arthur Briscoe had been killed. It was an emotional time for all of us who worked the area in law enforcement, and now we were investigating the case. These officers were well respected in the community and all wanted to help in the apprehension of Ralph Bays. Kentucky State Police investigated this case, and it was presented to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office and their team. After 2 years of trial preparation, this case was presented to a jury. After a 3-week-long trial, Ralph Stephen Bays Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to death. It was a relief to all involved to hear the verdict and the sentence given. This was especially important to the Bennett and the Briscoe families. Ralph Bays never disputed his guilt, his involvement, nor showed remorse. There have been 2 death warrants signed over the years, and now it's time for the 3rd. Thank you. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Lieutenant. It's also my privilege to introduce Senator Brandon Smith, who is here on behalf of the community. He represents Powell County. He has been an extraordinary partner in this process, someone that is also fighting to ensure that those sacrifices of those 2 law enforcement officers are never forgotten. Senator Smith.
Folks, I appreciate each of you being here with us. You know, for us in the region, I had just come home from the Gorge with several friends when I heard about the shooting. And at first we were not sure if they had just been shot, or we learned later they had actually been killed. It took 0.06 seconds for those for the first one to be shot and to lose his life. And it's ridiculous to think that now, after 3 decades of abuse of the system, that this family and these jurors, people that had to make a very difficult decision, then to have to sit and watch it be delayed and delayed and delayed. And I have notes, but I will tell you that our AG is so strong at what he has done and reflects our district so well. Honestly, I don't need him, but what I do need to say is this: that for a lot of people, it was a national story. It was never a national story to us. For a lot of people, it was a statewide story. It was sensational, having men in the line of duty killed, but again, it wasn't for us. It wasn't even that much of a local story as it was a personal community story. Right across the street from my home that I have grown up in was a family that was shattered because this was their family that had been killed. And they suffered with this quietly for many years, and just recently, as this case came back to light, as the governor failed to do his job, was I contacted by someone I've known for almost 60 years to tell me their story, and they said, "Brandon, we thought we would pass away before justice was served in our family." And then their voice cracked a little bit, and I could really tell somebody that I've known for so long was truly struggling, that you were bringing them some justice. And it was tough on me. It's tough on me now to think about it. But this is well overdue. Now, we all know that, that just like Biden said he couldn't close the border, and then Trump did. And I say that because this governor says he can't issue this death sentence because he needs extra laws or something like that. And we all know that's not true. There's not a reporter here that thinks that true. It's true. But if this is some measure that we have to fulfill to move forward to get this family justice, I will tell you I'm absolutely committed. And if you ask our sheriff and law enforcement today, had you known that you were walking into that same thing, you would have still had to go because somebody else would have had to go in your stead. And so I stand here today and I've teased the AG. I said, he's the sheriff and I'm the deputy here. We're here to do our job. It's not fun. We didn't sign up for this, but it's something that the people of the Commonwealth elected us to do, just like these men had to go on that day. And we go so that nobody else has to come and do this behind us. Hopefully this is the last time that two people have to come in order to get a family for my area justice. So they've said justice denied and justice delayed has gone too far in this case, and I agree. I've spoken longer than I wanted to, but this could not happen without good leadership. And when our men and women put on a uniform in the state of Kentucky and they go out there to carry this stuff out, they need to be 100% sure we're behind them, and we are. Me being here today reflects that the Commonwealth of Kentucky is proud of you men and women, and we stand with you. To have an AG as strong as we have now is something Kentucky's needed for a long time, and I'm sure law enforcement and other elected officials like us take great comfort and strength from you standing on this issue. And so for those of you at home, hopefully we have done our duty today, just like what was called upon these men so long ago. Thank you.
Finally, there's a saying in the sheriff's community showing the brotherhood and sisterhood of Kentucky sheriffs. There's a saying that no sheriff stands alone. It's indicative of how these men and women have each other's backs. It is indicative of oftentimes how thin they are in rural counties. They rely on their brothers and sisters in law enforcement. We ask Kentucky law enforcement to walk out the door every day knowing that they may never come back. They carry the heavy weight of the badge. So to share just a bit of what that weight looks like on behalf of the men and women of the Kentucky Sheriff's Association, it's my privilege to bring up Lewis County Sheriff Johnny Bivens to say a few words.
Thank you, General. On behalf of the Kentucky Sheriff's Association and every sheriff across this state, I'm honored to be here to represent them and be supportive of Deputy Briscoe and Sheriff Bennett. I first want to commend the Attorney General Coleman and his staff. In today's case, I've seen many of you all there. They delivered it clearly, precisely, and professionally. And what I heard on the other side was a lot of word salad. This case is clear, and I commend you, General, for bringing it back to the forefront. I also respectfully agree with our governor. He once said, the death penalty does need to be on the books for certain offenders, those that commit horrible crimes, and for dangerous people. Ralph Bays defines both of those elements. Honoring a jury's verdict is a foundational principle of the American legal system. While legal processes allow for appeals and in rare circumstances, judicial intervention, the system was designed to respect the collective judgment of citizens who have sat through a trial and examined the evidence. I would just, again, on behalf of the Kentucky Sheriff's Association, I'm grateful to be here I think it's time that we move forward. The evidence was clear, and just thank you all.
It's easy to talk about the rule of law standing in front of beautiful edifices like this. It's easy to use those terms, the rule of law, when you're standing behind podiums like this with flags on your left and on your right. But the rule of law requires that we serve justice. The rule of law requires that we follow through on pledges to protect our men and women of law enforcement. The rule of law requires that when we ask jurors to make terrible decisions, that we then effectuate those decisions. The rule of law requires that we move forward in this case. Again, as the Attorney General of this Commonwealth, I call again on our governor to sign a death warrant. Do it this afternoon. Bring justice to this family. Honor these men and women of law enforcement. To do anything else is a straw dog. To point to any other obstacle is a straw dog, as we know. And I would just want to commend these men and women and commend those that are going to be out there tonight when we're sleeping safely in our beds. I want to say thank you as a dad and as your Attorney General. And I want to say thank you for being here, gentlemen. Thank you for honoring these families and these victims. And so with that, any questions that we can take, anything we can address?
What is the next step regarding the timeline?
We're waiting on Judge Shepard, the Franklin Circuit Court, to make a decision. This is not only weighty, this is a complicated matter. It's not often I refer members of the press to our brief, but our arguments were summarized. This is dozens and dozens of pages that over and over knock down the sophistry on the other side. It is time for the court to move forward. And 20 years ago when this case, as Mr. Hayburn, our fantastic advocate, said, 20 years ago there were big issues that needed to be worked through. The Supreme Court needed to determine whether regulations should control changes in the protocol. There were big issues, weighty protocol issues to be worked through. Today, behind me, we were talking about issues such as, does execution really mean death? It's sophistry now. We're beyond the big issues. It's time for the court to act. We look forward to the court moving forward, making the decision. But in terms of Ralph Bays, that case in particular, the timeline could be this afternoon if the governor chose to do so.
The governor has stated that there's issues with the chemical compound. It's not available. It would be impossible for executions to happen today. What's your response to that?
Well, I appreciate you raising this. The governor's raised two limiting factors to why he can't sign that death warrant. One involved the chemicals used to effectuate a death. President Trump signed an executive order early in his administration ordering the U.S. Department of Justice to assist states like ours to obtain those medications. We have been in contact with the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and we stand ready to assist the Kentucky Department of Corrections in obtaining those. Also, within the last year and a half, there have been executions just north of the river in Indiana, lawful executions. The state of Indiana has been able to obtain these medications. Other states have. It's a straw dog, unfortunately. Also, though, the governor has raised what's known as an intellectual disability claim. A new regulation has to work its way, and that's some of what we discussed earlier today. And yes, there is a regulation that is working forward that applies to some of those on death row. Here's what's interesting. It doesn't apply to Ralph Bays. He's never had an intellectual disability. So it is, again, it's a straw dog. And so we call on the governor to act today to move forward to bring justice to those families.
On this case, if the court rules in the Attorney General's office's favor, what immediate effect does that have for Kentucky?
Jack, you want to help me with this one?
If the court grants our motion today, this case would be over, and that would remove all doubt about there being any legal impediments to carrying out executions for individuals such as Ralph Bays. A lot of the dispute has been about this temporary injunction that was entered in this case 16 years ago in 2010. Our office has studied the issue closely and determined that that injunction doesn't apply to individuals like Ralph Bays. But the governor has persisted in his belief that it does. So what we're talking about with our motion is ending the case, which would dissolve that injunction, and removing all doubt whatsoever about whether death warrants can be issued.
If the judge were not to rule in your favor, what would be the next step?
Well, and want to summarize this. First, I wanted you to see those that weren't in court earlier today, the caliber of our advocates that are serving in the Attorney General's office. Immediately, there are a dozen death warrants that could go to the governor's desk. That's your answer in a nutshell. A dozen or so death warrants would be right to be signed by the governor. But please, will you repeat that? Sure.
If the judge were not to rule in your office's favor, what would be the next steps?
I don't want to give you the lawyer's answer, but it depends. We'll cross that bridge. There were so many components. We're seeking for the judge to dismiss all of them. There could be nuances. It depends upon what the judge's order says. So I want to be very careful. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We look forward to the judge ruling in our favor.
Can you tell us about the related case that's going to be in the Kentucky Supreme Court? What will you be arguing? What are they considering? About the related case that's going to be before the Kentucky Supreme Court this summer.
Yeah, Jack.
In addition to this civil case, where there's about 15 or so death row inmates who've banded together to challenge the regulation, each individual death row inmate also has their own individual cases where they're able to challenge their conviction through multiple rounds of appeal. So the upcoming argument in the Kentucky Supreme Court is one of those. It's actually two individual cases.
Can you say their names?
I believe Sanders and Matthews.
Attorney General, Mr. Hayburn mentioned during his arguments that this has been a costly process. If you had to estimate, one, what has the cost been to the taxpayers thus far for this litigation? And then two, how does that compare to housing an inmate on death row?
Yeah, you raise a great question. It's I wouldn't call it return on investment, but it's one that we're going to have to follow up. It is cost in the aggregate, litigating this for 20 years, arguably millions of dollars. But that's not, the cost benefit is not what this is about. And we can certainly provide those, but we don't approach these cases through the perspective of housing versus litigating. We approach these cases through the perspective of providing justice for families. And if that sounds like podium talk, we look these families in the eye. We meet and hold these families' hands before every proceeding. You see how families feel traumatized over and over and over again. Whether it's the palatial Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati, whether it's the Powell Circuit Court, or whether it's here in Franklin County. Every one of these. We had Ms. Lally, who lost her brother and her brother-in-law when Ralph Bays assassinated them. She wasn't able to join us today. She was watching via Zoom, hearing what this is like over and over and over again. That's the cost. The cost is that people in this Commonwealth question the rule of law, question when decades later, with an admission of guilt and no question, no gray as to guilt, why the jury's decision can't be effectuated. That's the cost. The impact on the rule of law and impact on these victims. That's the real cost. Happy to provide you with the numbers, but that's what we're talking about here today.
Media friends, we have time for one more question.
Speaking about the amount of time, some of the numbers from the state, I mean, they show the average time death row inmate is now 27 years. The longest amount of time, I mean, it is almost 45. This is a significant amount of time. Can you talk about that aspect of all of this?
So I would encourage you to look at our materials that lay out those that are on death row and look at those numbers. Carolina, we're talking about, as you say, decades and decades and decades. What concerns me as the state's chief law enforcement officer is that we know when there is not swift and certain justice, we know that we see the rule of law eroding. the name of the game for us is deterrence in law enforcement. For these men and women, we want to prevent the harm. We want to prevent the victimization. And when you have a system where there is not real punishment with the most heinous offenders, then the rule of law becomes shaky. That's the impact. Years, decades, and decades. My worst day as Attorney General last year was in Scott County, standing in a courtroom when the judge sentenced the offender that took Scott County deputy from us, Caleb Conley. Life without possibility of parole. That was the most certain sentence that we could achieve in that environment, because the death penalty in this Commonwealth essentially has not existed for most of my lifetime, at least for the last 15 years. So the real cost is the impact on the rule of law. It's the lack of swift and the lack of certain justice. So with that, thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Much.